Hi guys, I'm the Aquarian Oracle. Welcome to my channel. I'm an intuitive reader, media researcher, and astrologer. I'm here to give you insight on things hidden in plain sight. Thanks so much for tuning in and joining me on this journey. Welcome to the first installment of our Unsolved Mysteries series. Guys, we're going to try to unpack a tale as old as time, as old as living memory. We are going to do a deep dive on the sinking of Titanic. The conspiracies surrounding the sinking of Titanic are numerous. There are so many conflicting and contradictory elements in the narrative, and because of this, I decided to post all of the different conspiracies that I've come across in my research to let you draw your own conclusions and do your own critical thinking. Please feel free to comment your take below. I want this to be a place of open dialogue and respectful exchanges of different perspectives. With each era in history, we ultimately see a whitewashed, one-note take on events that is then solidified into an official account. And once there is a lack of nuance regarding how events actually happened, we are left with a flat, Hollywood-style version of history and a singular, state-sanctioned truth, a la the 9/11 Commission. There is a loss of historical complexity, with many valid insights pushed aside and delegitimized by the single codified narrative. Lucky for us, though, the truth is often hidden in plain sight. Let's use this moment to reflect on where we've come from. Let's revisit a story first told 112 years ago, one that has laid the foundation for the world we live in today. Let's go back to Titanic. Tale as old as time. Let's be honest, the story most of us know regarding the great ship that foundered is the one presented in the 1997 film by James Cameron. Using Titanic herself as our starting point, unpacking her story and unsolved mysteries, let's reframe our understanding of what it is we think we know. Is Cameron's telling of events a mere caricature? As overdone as Rose's art collection of Picasso's, Degas, and Monet's? Indeed, there's truth, but no logic. Titanic was commissioned by the White Star Line from builders Harland and Wolff. She was made in Belfast, Ireland. She was intended to be one of three sister ships: Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. Olympic and Titanic were nearly identical sister ships. And it's funny because Cameron's movie doesn't mention the Olympic at all. Not once. The movie praises Titanic as an unprecedented marvel, when in reality, she was only slightly bigger than the Olympic, and built with a nearly identical design. In May of 1912, the month after Titanic foundered, an even larger ship was launched, the German ship SS Imperator. Indeed, why do we consider Titanic to be the ship of dreams, an unparalleled work of mankind, when there were other, very similar luxurious vessels in existence at the same time? Watching Cameron's film, you would never know this. Let's take a look at the following exchange early on in the film between Joseph Bruce Ismay, director of the White Star Line, and Thomas Andrews, the builder of Titanic. She is the largest moving object ever made by the hand of man in all history. The idea was Mr. Ismay's. He envisioned a steamer so grand in scale and so luxurious in its appointments that its supremacy would never be challenged. And here she is, willed into solid reality. Another thing the movie fails to mention is that J.P. Morgan was the owner of the White Star Line, a subsidiary of his International Mercantile Marine Company. He is someone who needs to be fully understood in the context of this story. It's a cardinal sin of the film that he's never brought up, not even in passing. Not once. My main issue with the mainstream Titanic narrative concerns the inquiry following the disaster. No one was truly held accountable for the sinking of Titanic. Not her captain, not the White Star Line, not the British Board of Trade. And indeed, Titanic was in full compliance with all Board of Trade mandates at the time, having gone through her inspection and being certified seaworthy. the British and American inquiries likely suppressed information in order to create a very streamlined narrative. If indeed this is true, it likely suggests some form of cover-up. I'm not necessarily saying I believe in any one version of Titanic's events, but I do know that when you see a rushed and colossally famous inquiry holding no one accountable, let's use the 9/11 Commission for example, there is a certain funneling effect that happens, one that does not allow us to delve as deeply as possible into contradictory evidence or alternative explanations. This enables a kind of subconscious programming to be foisted onto the masses by simplifying the story into an easily understood fable. And reality is not a fairy tale. Reality is stranger than fiction. Titanic's scenario may prove reminiscent of how the 9/11 Commission unfolded, giving us a good sense of how collusion operates between corporations and the government in order to limit thorough investigations into the truth, confining public discourse to a rigidly accepted version of events. Mass media is always complicit in reducing access to certain lines of questioning, thus yielding half-truth answers that become elevated to the level of myth and doctrine. Mass media has always been in the pocket of a select few movers and shakers. Plus, it's very easy to censor the truth, as we can bear witness to with events being reported on in our modern day and age. How often does the media continuously lie to us? And we have the internet in our pockets here in 2024. Imagine how much easier it would have been to censor things that didn't go along with an elite agenda, thinking back over a century ago. Photography not having the reach that it later would, motion pictures not being able to capture events and share them quickly the way we can today. There have been quantum leaps in documentation over the last 112 years. Indeed, even the internet of today is a far cry from how it was in 1997, in its infancy, during the era of James Cameron's Titanic. I share all this to reiterate that, as faithful as any telling of events from April 14th and 15th, 1912 might be, we cannot disregard Titanic's complicating variables and what could have happened behind the scenes. It would have been very easy to censor and blackball workers, manipulate different forms of documentation, and have things that weren't suited be tucked under the rug. The ways that this subterfuge could have taken place and what this means for a broader historical narrative is really more what I want to emphasize in this video. This is not meant to be a definitive proving of a single conspiracy, but a shedding of light onto a magnitude of suppressed information, and how an agenda is reflected in codified, solidifying one gospel narrative in the public imagination. The 1955 nonfiction book A Night to Remember by Walter Lord essentialized a mainstream Titanic narrative for the mid-century generation. It was later adapted into a 1958 film. It's worth noting Walter Lord served in London with the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, during World War II, the OSS being cited by the CIA as America's first intelligence agency. In a strange, full-circle moment, Lord would later act as an advisor to James Cameron on his 1997 film. And indeed, at the end of the century, we were ripe for a reimagining of Titanic, with all the phenomenal special effects of a 90s-era disaster thriller. But did James Cameron's film also serve as a kind of predictive programming for a cultural shift to come? More on that in part 2, where I'll discuss how the film shaped our collective imagination and quite possibly primed us for the imagery surrounding the collapse of a new millennium's monolith. Connections to the Federal Reserve. In many ways, our understanding of Titanic is framed by White Star Line propaganda and the mythology applied after the sinking. Let's look back at J.P. Morgan, the American banker-industrialist who purchased the White Star Line with the approval of the British government, under the stipulation that White Star Line ships would be able to be commandeered during time of war. J.P. Morgan is obviously a very controversial figure in world history, especially with regards to the creation of the Federal Reserve in the United States. This is where a lot of the conspiracies have their origin. The idea that certain millionaire passengers on Titanic were specifically assassinated because they did not comply with the creation of the Federal Reserve, which took place on December 23, 1913, a short 18 months after Titanic careened to the bottom of the North Atlantic. Let's see if this theory holds any water. There is a very brief window of time between the creation of the Federal Reserve at the end of 1913 and the onset of World War I, with the assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand on June 28, 1914. The creation of the Federal Reserve would certainly prove an asset to the war effort, allowing for money to be leveraged in a way that could finance the movers and shakers as they redrew the boundaries of the known world to better suit their needs. The Federal Reserve did this by facilitating war bond sales and providing loans at preferential rates to banks purchasing treasury certificates. Indeed, it's safe to say major wars are planned well in advance. Several of the world's wealthiest men, among them real estate developer John Jacob Astor, Macy's co-owner Isidor Straus, and mining magnate Benjamin Guggenheim, were on board Titanic. One of the main conspiracy theories posits that because they were involved in industry, retail, and leisure, not necessarily finance, that they would have had their business efforts undermined by the creation of the Federal Reserve. The only problem with this theory is that there's no documented evidence that these men opposed the Federal Reserve. In fact, Isidor Straus was on record as being in favor of the Federal Reserve, according to 2 October 1911 stories published in the New York Times. I think we can probably rule out the theory claiming these obscenely wealthy men were assassinated, but there is likely something symbolically linking the creation of the Federal Reserve with Titanic. I mean, what are the odds that tax day falls on April 15th, coinciding with the anniversary of Titanic plunging into the Atlantic? How funny that the date of a ritual involving the fall of a mythical titan, and it being sealed away in the underworld like Tartarus, should coincide with a ritual commemorating the reinvention of American currency, current C. J.P. Morgan was a major shareholder in the Federal Reserve, and he was also the largest shareholder in the International Mercantile Marine Company, which controlled the White Star Line, to which Titanic belonged, and the Leyland Line, to which the Californian belonged. The Californian being the ship that was cited as being nearest to Titanic the night of her sinking. Though notably not on board during Titanic's maiden voyage, as he was initially scheduled to be, Morgan is an integral player in Titanic's story. Why Cameron would not mention him in his telling of events is beyond me. He is never brought up in Cameron's film, not once. Indeed, there were several passengers who canceled their reservations on Titanic, J.P. Morgan being the most noteworthy among them. It has been said that Morgan was dealing with legal issues regarding exporting his vast art collection from France. There are also stories that he allegedly fell ill and wanted to recuperate. At about the time of the sinking, he was said to be seen in a French resort with his mistress. Whatever the case, Morgan had his own reasons for not being on Titanic. It was actually his birthday on April 17th, a day which, in 1912, coincided with a new moon solar eclipse, which could be seen as symbolizing the beginning of a new cycle. Morgan died just shy of a year later, on March 31st, 1913, about 7 months before the creation of the Federal Reserve. The Great Sister Ship Swap. To better understand Titanic, let's turn our attention to her older sister, Olympic, a ship launched on June 14, 1911, roughly 1 year before Titanic set sail. What's interesting about Olympic is she actually had several incidents at sea under the command of Captain Edward John Smith, who would later be the captain on Titanic during her fateful maiden voyage. On September 20th, 1911, the HMS Hawke would be pulled into the Olympic's path off the Isle of Wight, as a function of the Olympic's massive suction effect on nearby ships. The HMS Hawk was a battering ship, and it bulldozed into the side of Olympic, causing steel frames to buckle and tearing 2 large holes in Olympic's hull both above and below the waterline. As a Royal Navy ship, the HMS Hawk was subject to an inquiry and ultimately pronounced free from any blame, leaving the White Star Line to deal with the financial burden of the incident, making it liable for the damage done to both ships. After 2 weeks of temporary patchwork, Olympic sailed to Belfast for remaining repairs until she finally returned to service on November 30th, 1911. The cost of Olympic's repairs was approximately $75,000. Some cite this figure as up to $125,000. Given the White Star Line is said to have made profits in excess of $1 million in 1911, I don't believe it makes sense to cite this setback as a plausible reason for a swap. However, a lot of conspiracy theories are going to cleave to the Olympic's collision with the Hawk as the turning point. They claim that the Olympic had become a huge liability to the White Star Line, with no way the company would be able to financially recover. The proposed solution? Switch the ships and sink the Olympic while she posed as her sister ship Titanic. Reap the insurance payout and let Titanic live out her life as the Olympic. But does this make any sense? Titanic cost roughly 1.5 million British pounds and was insured for only 2/3 that amount, at 1 million pounds. This fact, coupled with the fact that a disaster on one of its premier ships would be a PR disaster for the White Star Line, seems to seriously deride the idea that the ships were switched for an insurance payout. There was one last brief interval of time at the beginning of March 1912 where Titanic and Olympic were berthed side by side in Belfast. While on her voyage from New York to Southampton on February 24th, Olympic hit a submerged object in the Atlantic and lost a propeller blade. She returned to Belfast for repairs before leaving on March 4th, 1912. Roughly 1 month before Titanic set out on her maiden voyage. It's during this 4-day window that the switch theorists posit the great swap of the twin ships was put into effect. But is that at all realistic? I don't think I can believe this take, yet it remains a trending theory on social media in spite of being largely debunked. But again, its origins resonate in a way that makes sense, given it was common at this time for there to be insurance fraud practices in Atlantic crossings involving immigrants in overloaded ships. And there are various instances of alleged insurance fraud throughout history. We need look no further than the insurance policy on the Twin Towers. Both Olympic and Titanic had specific yard numbers at Harland and Wolff, Olympic labeled 400 and Titanic 401. So in addition to needing to account for these numbers being etched throughout the ships, you would have to switch anything cosmetically linked to the name and identity of each ship. All this while also changing any structural differences between the two vessels. Without getting into the nitty-gritty of these differences, there were definitely distinguishing features and layout differences, including the following on Titanic: an enclosed A-deck promenade, first-class accommodations on B-deck that included enclosed promenades in deluxe parlor suites, an extended first-class a la carte restaurant on the port side of the ship, at the expense of second-class deck space, and a first-class restaurant promenade on the starboard side, with the new Café Parisien. Conspiracy theories might also point to the fact that Olympic had 16 bow portholes, whereas Titanic had 14. The trick in this is that Titanic was actually refitted with 16 portholes prior to her maiden voyage in order to allow for more light and ventilation into the crew galley, having previously had 14 portholes like her sister Olympic. The Olympic was actually refitted with 16 portholes later on in 1912 for the same reason. As just mentioned, the two deluxe parlor suites on Titanic's B-deck, which did not exist on Olympic, each came with their own private promenade. These millionaire suites were the most luxurious first-class accommodations available, and they are actually featured in Cameron's film, most iconically during the scene where Cal flips out at Rose, knocking over a promenade table after their exchanges concerning her night in third class. Fun fact: The parlor suite occupied by Cal and Rose, cabins B-52, 54, 56, was actually occupied by Joseph Bruce Ismay, director of the White Star Line, during the actual maiden voyage of Titanic. We'll come back to Ismay later on. Again, the idea of a switch taking place, with specific men handpicked and sworn to secrecy, swapping all of the elements of the two ships in a 4-day window, just doesn't make sense to me. I'm no shipbuilder, but it's hard for me to give credence to this line of thought. Fire in the hole. Another popular theory involves there being a coal fire aboard Titanic and it being a liability in her journey across the Atlantic. The build-up to Titanic's maiden voyage occurred against the backdrop of a national strike by coal miners in the United Kingdom, with workers looking to secure a minimum wage. There were very few ships making the transatlantic passage, and even Titanic herself had to receive transfers of coal from other ships docked in Southampton before setting out on her maiden voyage. Some posited that it is strange for only 2 coal stokers out of her original 163 to have stayed on board Titanic during her maiden voyage. Did they know something that we don't? Some have put forward the idea that the raging coal fire in the No. 6 coal store weakened Titanic's hull, making her vulnerable at sea. Others claim, and I'm inclined to believe, that the more logical justification seems to be that intense work was required for coal stokers to extinguish such a large blaze. It could also be said that these workers were local to Europe, only traveling between Belfast and Southampton, even though there was a coal strike and work was scarce. Other ships on the scene. Let's briefly lend our attention to the ship that's on record as being closest to Titanic the night of the sinking, the SS Californian. Helmed by Captain Stanley Lord, the Californian has been etched into history as the infamous vessel that failed to come to Titanic's aid. Some conspiracy theorists have posited that the Californian was stationed where she was to act as a kind of rescue vessel, ultimately failing to do so. But does this make sense? It's important to note that the SS Californian had no passengers, and that the only items she had on board were London textiles, woolen sweaters, blankets, and other general goods. Many people have asked if there was another ship in addition to the SS Californian in the vicinity of Titanic, that a mystery ship called the Samson was closer to Titanic than the Californian. According to various accounts, the Californian was anywhere between 10 and 20 miles away from Titanic. The Carpathia was 58 miles away, which is why she took so long to get to the scene. The Samson was supposedly only 7 miles away. Leslie Harrison, General Secretary of the Mercantile Marine Association in the 1960s, was a strong advocate of the theory that placed the Samson near Titanic while she foundered. In a 1963 article written for The Guardian called "Clue to the Titanic Ghost Ship," he argued that the captain of the Californian had been victimized by a grave miscarriage of justice. The theory goes that the Samson was seal hunting illegally in territorial waters. It had allegedly sailed away from Titanic so as not to be prosecuted for carrying 3,000 pounds of seal meat harvested from Canadian waters. The ship was actually later sold in the 1920s to Richard Evelyn Byrd, who renamed the ship City of New York. This ship was used in Byrd's first expedition to Antarctica in 1928. It was his flagship vessel. Byrd is cited as being the first person to conduct a flight over the South Pole, an act which is no longer permitted today. Who knows what's truly hidden in Antarctica? But that's a story for another day. Those shipping records seem to prove that the Samson was not near Titanic. The extent to which Samson was or wasn't present still vigorously seems up for debate. And how strange that the ship should then make its way into the hands of someone undertaking his inaugural trek to Antarctica. Richard Byrd is a very important person in terms of Atlantic exploration, and given that he is from such an esteemed lineage, Byrd is actually the 8th great-grandchild of John Rolfe and Pocahontas. This only further adds a level of intrigue and fascination, especially given how restricted the exploration of Antarctica has become. And again, how strange that the ship should be renamed City of New York, the city that Titanic was destined for but would never reach. Some more fun facts. Did you know that 2 of Pocahontas' descendants would go on to become First Ladies? One of them was Edith Wilson, wife of Woodrow Wilson. The other was Nancy Reagan, wife of Ronald Reagan. The world is a small place, especially in elite circles. Captain Smith. When thinking of the 1997 film, one can't help but recall its portrayal of Captain Edward John Smith. He is depicted as a kind of Santa Claus-looking grandfatherly man, a very benevolent yet easily manipulated figure. Rest in peace to actor Bernard Hill, who played him. He recently passed on May 5th, 2024. As for real-life Captain Smith, his career was actually riddled with blunders. But were these incidents used as leverage against him in a conspiracy to sink Titanic? My research was focused on episodes that would foreshadow his Titanic debacle. Smith helmed numerous vessels that endured various mishaps. Most relevant to our story is the fact that he was captain of the Olympic when she collided with the HMS Hawk in 1911, the incident at the heart of the ship swap insurance fraud theory. Captain Smith oversaw multiple accidents with the Olympic, the Republic, the Germanic, the Coptic, and the Majestic. Smith is said to have chosen his own crew for Titanic, swapping many of the intended officers who were to be on board. Why did he unexpectedly shuffle the roster of officers for Titanic's maiden voyage? Titanic No. 2 officer Henry Wilde, in a final letter to his sister mailed when Titanic stopped in Ireland, remarked, in the wake of being forced to accompany Captain Smith, that I still don't like this ship. I have a queer feeling about it. Queer indeed. The vibes were definitely off. Written in the stars. Let's take a moment to look at the timing of the Titanic disaster. Truly a singular alignment, allowing Titanic to persist as the stuff of legend for more than a century to come. The full moon supermoon on January 4th, 1912 was the largest supermoon in 1400 years and was posited to cause extreme tidal activity that disrupted and dislodged icebergs from a glacier in Greenland, bringing them further south than expected. The night Titanic sank was unusually dark because it was a balsamic moon. This is what astrologers refer to as the final days before a new moon. It was a still, silent night with no wind. There was a high-pressure system at the time, making the sea uncommonly calm, and thus making icebergs hard to detect, given there were no ripples at the base of the bergs. When we think of the encounter with the iceberg, there were so many things that went wrong, so many variables compounding one another for maximum destruction. If the ship had hit the iceberg head-on, it is believed that the watertight compartments would have been able to keep her afloat. Turning the ship ensured that she would not endure. One can't help but wonder, was she intentionally brought toward an iceberg, put in the line of fire on purpose, guided by the hand of man instead of the hand of God? And for what reason? Distress rockets. Another important point of confusion seems to be the rockets that Titanic launched in order to indicate that she was experiencing distress. Fourth Officer Joseph Boxhall testified in the United States Senate hearing after the sinking because he was in charge of firing the distress rockets. But the question remains, were these rockets actually fired as quote-unquote distress rockets? According to the 1912 International Rules of the Road governing signals of distress, these are supposed to be explosive devices or cannons fired at approximately 1-minute intervals. Officer Boxhall commenced firing rockets at roughly 12:45 a.m. and continued firing them at roughly 5 to 7-minute intervals, with a total of 8 rockets launched. It should be noted that there are some discrepancies in the number and color of rockets that were testified to in the inquiries, with the official number being declared as 8 white rockets. Some of the rockets were believed to be colored by people on Titanic, but this may have been a result of the steam hovering above the ship on that windless night, perhaps causing the rockets to appear as different colors. Officer Boxhall was likely firing these rockets in the middle of sending Morse lamp signals toward the Californian. And who knows how or if the loading of passengers into lifeboats impacted the rate of rocket launches. Again, it's just strange why they weren't fired more aggressively at quicker intervals, especially given how dire the situation was. Is this a question of incompetence in a difficult situation, a mere misunderstanding, Or is there another agenda at play? Firing rockets doesn't necessarily mean disaster. Rockets could signify something as simple as, "I'm here at this location, engine difficulties, please stand clear." There wasn't unequivocally the perception that these were distress rockets, even though they were being fired at relatively short intervals. The Californian, on the record, believed the flares to be company rockets, which are signals between ships of the same line. This was the justification given for not coming to Titanic's aid. Just for fun, I've seen theories that suggest the flares seen by the Californian were actually fired by the Samson in order to call back its sealing boats. This one is hard for me to indulge, because wouldn't the Titanic have observed those flares? It's a very strange notion, but one that I mention for the sake of completion. Both American and British inquiries failed to investigate why the rockets were not launched at a more aggressive pace. It'll just send you in circles, looking up the different takes on how many rockets there were, and what did they mean, and were they colored, and what was the reason for how quickly they were launched. It's also worth noting that the cold air near the surface of the ocean the night of the sinking caused an abnormal superrefraction effect, making the Titanic loom higher than she would have normally. Superrefraction made the iceberg hard to see and distorted the Californian's view of Titanic. It made objects appear higher and nearer than they actually were, creating a false horizon, and also making the rocket flares appear to be at about half the height of the steamer's masthead light, according to Second Officer Herbert Stone, from his view in a lifeboat. Communication breakdown. Let's examine another central variable at the heart of Titanic's story, the failure of wireless communication. In particular, the Marconi messages that were not received aboard the Californian while Titanic was sinking. Wireless communication was not yet seen as vital before the Titanic incident. It was more of a novelty, a plaything of the wealthy, used to send messages in a frivolous way. It wasn't one of the integral facets of naval communication, the only major exception being if something was directly addressed to a ship's captain. Only then would it be given priority. The radio operator on the Californian was named Cyril Evans. He messaged Jack Phillips on the Titanic at roughly 11 p.m. to communicate their location and that they were stopped in the middle of an ice field. Evans did not address this gram MSG, which stood for Master Service Gram, which was customary for all messages intended for the bridge. Evans was responded to with an abrupt, "Keep out, shut up, I'm working Cape Race." In other words, I'm busy sending messages for the wealthy patrons on Titanic. Don't cloud my reception. Evans shortly thereafter turns off his wireless and goes to bed for the night. Again, the primary purpose of wireless communication in 1912 was to pass private messages between ship and shore, and also the ship's owners and her captain while at sea. Sending logistics regarding navigation was not really the point. Most ships directly communicated with Morse lamps, flag signals, and pyrotechnics. And also, it's worth noting that Evans was the only Marconi operator on board the Californian, and it was not realistic to have him work a 24-hour shift. After observing rockets coming from Titanic, the Californian reportedly makes efforts to communicate using Morse lamps. However, given that there was a communication breakdown using the lamps, it is strange that Captain Lord did not have his single Marconi operator wake up and communicate directly. Again, the failure of the Morse lamps was likely due to the superrefraction we previously discussed, resulting in the form of optical illusions and distortions. So, why didn't Captain Lord reach out to Cyril Evans, especially given that the Californian was making other efforts to communicate? Why not wake up your operator if you're at all concerned that your Morse lamps aren't being properly received? Was this a matter of gross incompetence and miscommunication, or was it a mandate from someone to stand down? Stepping back from that conjecture, what further compounds placing blame on the Californian is that we have to bear in mind it was allegedly surrounded by ice, having communicated that to Titanic. Would the Californian have meaningfully been able to prevent mass loss of life even if she had headed toward the scene of the sinking? Regardless of the complexities of the full truth, the communication breakdowns the night of Titanic's sinking helped transform radio into a very necessary part of naval security systems. In addition to transforming official regulations for how distress signals need to be sent, and also the number of lifeboats that need to be on board a vessel at sea. Believing the hype. Let's rewind for a moment and talk about the hype surrounding the maiden voyage of Titanic. While she was certainly promoted as a feat of modern engineering and a pinnacle of opulent luxury, as well as being quote-unquote nearly unsinkable, we can't help but notice that much of Titanic's mythology has been retroactively applied. Titanic was the second ship in a line. She was nearly identical to the Olympic, with only minor structural differences that would likely go over the head of a casual observer. Why would there be unparalleled hoopla around her, like Cameron's film and other narratives suggest, when the Olympic made her maiden voyage a year earlier and had a lofty launch? Even after the sinking, a number of newspapers incorrectly used images of Olympic when reporting the disaster. And as we mentioned earlier, there was a German ship, the SS Imperator, launched in May 1912, that was even bigger than Titanic. It's not like Titanic existed in a vacuum. She was certainly impressive, but so were other ships of the era. Titanic's total carrying capacity, with maximum passengers and maximum crew on board, was over 3,300 souls. Further unpacking the mythology, let's discuss how, even though Titanic actually had space for approximately 2,450 passengers, she only had 1,317 passengers on board, 324 in first class, 284 in second class, and 709 in third class. This means Titanic was at just about 50% passenger capacity. Remember, this is in the middle of a coal strike, where many chartered Atlantic crossings were cancelled. Granted, April is not necessarily a high time for travel, like summer, but still, why so few passengers and why so many crew members? Of the approximately 2,240 people reportedly on board Titanic, more than 900 were crew members. Again, I'm no naval expert, but I have to ask, were Titanic's numbers being artificially padded? Let's look at survivors by category. 202 survivors out of 324 in first class. 118 survivors out of 284 in second class. 174 survivors out of 709 in third class. 212 survivors out of over 900 crew members. We can't help but wonder, especially in terms of crew members, and even third-class passengers for that matter, were all these people really on board Titanic? This is obviously just conjecture, but it does get you thinking. Maybe we don't know everything that we think we know. Taking the Chevy to the levee. I can't help but wonder, how many people truly saw the iceberg, observing its impact in real time? How many of these people were passengers versus crew? And was there anything that helped the iceberg seal Titanic's fate after contact? As was conceivably the case with the Twin Towers, could there have been explosives that ensured the monolith's fate was sealed after an initial impact? Was Titanic a controlled demolition at sea? Who's to say once contact had been made with an iceberg that there weren't extra assurances put in place to make sure the ship foundered? A bomb in one of the front compartments, perhaps. Again, this is all conjecture and merely meant to spark dialogue and a deconstruction of the version that has been so ingrained in our collective consciousness. It seems so ideal, in a way, if we are to indulge this conspiracy. And again, this is only a conspiracy. Please don't cite it as an official treatise. If I wanted to intentionally sink Titanic, whether as a White Star Line competitor or as a highly influential person with an occulted agenda, I would find a way to bring her into treacherous waters on a new moon with no visibility. I would place her in the line of fire in the hopes that a collision would happen. Explosives would be used as a backup just in case to ensure the ship founders. Take the Chevy to the levee and say goodbye to American Pie. This kind of theory plays into the trope that instead of being killed for their opposition to the Federal Reserve, maybe many of the movers and shakers on board were in on the fix and used this incident to fake their deaths. Perhaps they knew that World War I was coming, and they decided to disappear into their vast fortunes off-grid. All this during an era with no means of documenting their whereabouts. Their deaths would make the accidental nature of the sinking more believable, coupled with what I imagine were massive life insurance payouts to their families. Anytime a disaster involves the equivalent of our modern-day billionaire class, we have to wonder, what is actually happening behind the scenes? What do they know that the uninitiated masses fail to grasp? For me, this line of thinking can't help but conjure the imagery of the Titan submersible disaster on June 18, 2023, which ignited global media attention. With so many extremely wealthy people involved, the notion lingers. Maybe we don't know the full extent of what transpired and what became of those on board. Again, just a theory. Returning to Titanic, with regards to her lower-class passengers, we have to wonder, was the roster bloated with already deceased people, or made-up people, or people who were intelligence agents? And again, so many crew members, nearly 80% of whom would die, on a ship traveling at only half-passenger capacity. Approximately 4/5 of Titanic's death toll is comprised of crew and third-class passengers. This is interesting, given that crew would likely only report an officially sanctioned narrative for fear of being blackballed or targeted by their employer overlords. Curiously enough, little was ever written about the third-class passengers. Reporters, the United States Senate investigation, and the British inquiry never bothered to interview any of the third-class survivors, most of whom spoke very little English. Was the Californian, an intended rescue vessel in some conspiracies, in fact told to stand down and take the fall for the disaster, while the wealthy patrons on board Titanic faked their deaths? In this scenario, the Californian and Carpathia would have had to been in on the fix. One also has to wonder what visual evidence exists of the bodies that were found after the wreck. I personally have not seen any images of the deceased either before or after being pulled from the Atlantic. Again, these are all theories that are merely conjecture. They're meant to get our minds open to new possible takes on a story we all think we know so well. I've even seen theories that posit there wasn't an iceberg, or that the ship never actually sank, and was cosmetically altered to become a different vessel. This specific line of thinking likes to note how one of Titanic's smokestacks was for purely aesthetic purposes, with only 3 smokestacks actually connected to her boilers. But if she did not sink, what's the wreckage we've seen time and again at the bottom of the ocean? While we can't give credence to all these theories, I think they do us a service in reminding us that the truth is out there, somewhere, if we read between the lines and think about the official story from the vantage point of what was suppressed, rather than what was codified into the historical record. A record that emphasizes human hubris and frailty, instead of appraising the disaster as potentially serving the designs of a hidden agenda. And as the iceberg in the parable so poetically suggests, what's hidden from sight is so often more impactful than what rests at the surface. Cameron's Titanic. It's important to unpack Cameron's film in a way that reveals where the truth has been bent in order to make way for a streamlined Hollywood narrative. We already addressed Captain Smith being mythologized as a very Santa Claus-like beneficent man, when in reality he had been involved in many incidents at sea, culminating in his poor stewardship of Titanic during her disastrous maiden voyage. You see a lot of blame being placed on Bruce Joseph Ismay in the film. He is very much vilified, much as he was in real life, for the Titanic debacle. He is the one egging on Captain Smith to light the remaining boilers, with iconic lines like, "Titanic must make headlines," and "retire with a bang, E.J." He's the one Rose roasts with a Freudian joke. Do you know of Dr. Freud, Mr. Ismay? His ideas about the male preoccupation with size might be of particular interest to you. Fun fact, the theory Rose is referencing wasn't published yet. It was first introduced in Freud's 1920 essay, Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Another inconsistency that is as ridiculous as Rose's private art collection. one that would put the Museum of Modern Art to shame. Obviously, as director of the White Star Line, Ismay wasn't totally innocent. But he allegedly was very helpful the night of the sinking, as he knew how dire the situation was because of the limited lifeboats available. He climbed into the last lifeboat lowered using the davits once there were no more passengers nearby. It's important to remember that, back in 1912, lifeboats were viewed as ferries to other ships, not as something meant to hold all souls on deck. Even in the case of an emergency, Titanic was never expected to sink. For context, let's look at this image of Olympic after her collision with the HMS Hawke in order to understand that these ships were meant to deal with massive gashes and still remain afloat. Titanic really was an unprecedented disaster, and it's not fair to reduce Ismay to sole villain of this story, like the film does. And indeed, the man was a psychological mess for the rest of his life, forever branded with the shame of surviving the sinking. For what it's worth, it's said he donated a significant sum to the pension fund for widows of Titanic, in addition to helping pay out various insurance claims from relatives of those killed in the disaster. On Titanic, there were 16 wooden lifeboats and 4 collapsible Engelhart boats. This is what was mandated by the Board of Trade in a law that was decades out of date. Titanic was fully in compliance with Board of Trade mandates when she set sail on her maiden voyage. It just wasn't expected that she would encounter a circumstance that would cause her to sink so quickly. Here's a wild fact involving Ismay. The Olympic offered to pick up Titanic survivors from on board the Carpathia. But Ismay rejected this offer, as he thought it would be traumatizing for survivors to board a ship nearly identical to the one they had just seen sink. Again, with reference to Captain Smith and Ismay, these are just two among many instances where the film portrays real people and circumstances in a streamlined way for dramatic effect. Cameron has even gone on record saying he regrets how he portrayed Officer William Murdoch, the armed officer in the film who fires at a passenger and later turns the gun in on himself. While there is information suggesting an officer did shoot himself and that this was potentially Murdoch, Cameron goes so far as to suggest he considered taking bribes and letting people onto boats, trivializing how Murdoch was essential in loading and dispatching many of the lifeboats. Cameron subsequently issued an apology to the Murdoch family. Again and again, we see a tendency to either simplify or completely omit historical figures in a way that caters to a very limited understanding of all of the policies and players shaping the scene. Contrary to the film's depiction, third-class passengers were not intentionally locked behind gates below deck during the sinking. U.S. immigration law required gates between different decks in order to limit the spread of disease. Third-class passengers, given their location deep within the bowels of the ship, were much farther away from lifeboats than other passengers, receiving information secondhand during the limited window of the sinking. Let's also remember that Titanic was a vast labyrinth with directions written in English, making it hard for many immigrants to understand where they were going. Perhaps a good number were awaiting further instructions from stewards in the maze below deck before it was ultimately too late. In any case, while there were undoubtedly much slimmer chances of survival for those in third class, there was no need for Cameron to make it appear that these passengers were actively trapped by stewards and had to break down gates in an attempt at escape. This specific depiction was yet another dramatic concession at the expense of historical integrity. These liberties taken for dramatic effect have flattened the complexity of what actually went wrong, and that's where the film veers into a kind of propaganda. A powerful, subtle form of mind control in the guise of entertainment, reducing the scope of reality while strangely, indirectly, priming us for the collapse of another great, unsinkable monolith. Concluding thoughts. To look at the aftermath of Titanic, it does appear political cover was given to the White Star Line during its British and American inquiries. Lord Mersey of the British inquiry did not find fault with the actions of Captain Smith or Bruce Ismay. The Board of Trade was not held accountable, even though the U.S. inquiry faulted the British Board of Trade for, quote, whose laxity of regulation and hasty inspection the world is likely indebted for this awful fatality. It was assuredly very easy to silence company men and not allow dissent from the authorized narrative. Captain Lord of the Californian received the bulk of the blame during the inquiry, but was never formally charged. In short, no one was responsible for the disaster. In keeping the White Star Line afloat after the incident, the United Kingdom ensured its access to the White Star Line's vessels during time of war, a stipulation in its contract with J.P. Morgan. The outbreak of World War I in 1914, 2 years after Titanic foundered, meant that the Olympic and Britannic were to be requisitioned for the war effort. In 1918, the Olympic became the only merchant ship to sink an enemy warship during World War I, ramming and sinking a German submarine. She returned to popular and reliable service after the war until she was taken apart in 1935. The Britannic was refitted as a hospital ship during the war, ultimately sinking in 1916 after a collision with a mine. Given this context, maybe it's not so outlandish after all to indulge the idea that Titanic may have been offered up as a sacrificial lamb of sorts in ways that still remain a mystery. Perhaps the best note to leave this video off on is a discussion of predictive programming surrounding Titanic. 14 years before Titanic set sail, a man named Morgan Robertson published a novella called Futility, later revised to The Wreck of the Titan after Titanic plunged into the depths of the Atlantic. Robertson's tale of a fictional ship called the Titan details the sinking of a colossal British ocean liner in the month of April after striking an iceberg, with not enough lifeboats for all souls on board and great loss of life. Was this telling a mere premonition of Titanic's actual fate, or was it something more? Again, how odd that Titanic should sink right before the creation of the Federal Reserve, which ironically commemorates its sinking on tax day. How strange that the Federal Reserve would be used to fund World War I only months after its creation, a war during which both Titanic's sister ships would serve, partly as a function of the White Star Line not being held accountable for the sinking of Titanic. Indeed, reality is stranger than fiction, and as obscure as the heart of the ocean. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I tried my best to be as fair and balanced as possible. Please leave comments to clarify or expand on any of the theories I shared. Truly, I'm just trying to hold space for conversation. I'm not married to any of the theories I've posited here. Whichever one floats gets my vote. Please like and subscribe, and stay tuned for my next video, where I'll do a deep dive into James Cameron's Titanic and the cultural landscape of the late 1990s. And if this film served indirectly as a visual primer for the collective bearing witness to the attacks of September 11th, 2001. Stay safe, and God bless.